a U.S. strike on Syria might prompt Hezbollah to retaliate either with missile attacks on northern Israel or terrorist attacks abroad, or both. There's certainly plenty to talk about Hezbollah in the here and now. But for the sake of context, and I think context is really important, let's start at the beginning. I mean, one of the main reasons I wrote this book over a very long period of time, about 9 years, minus my time in government, was because there was so little out there in the public domain about Hezbollah's history of covert activities abroad. If you want to understand Hezbollah, you have to understand that it is a political party in Lebanon. It is a social welfare provider in Lebanon. It is the largest standing militia in Lebanon, larger and better trained and more disciplined than the Lebanese armed forces. But it is also an international organized criminal organization. It is also a terrorist group with global reach, with a global footprint. And there was very, very little literature about that anywhere. This hit home for me 9 years ago. I had just left the FBI. It was before I was brought into Treasury. And I was invited to a U.S. government unclassified but by invitation only conference on Lebanon and Hezbollah. And many of the speakers were brought in from Lebanon, but each of the sessions was chaired by someone from the U.S. government. And it was co-sponsored by two parts of the U.S. intelligence community. So I wasn't surprised, I wasn't shocked that some people came from Lebanon and said things that I disagreed with, but I was very surprised and very shocked at some of the things they said that the U.S. government moderators and sponsors didn't respond to, didn't contradict, didn't say, well, maybe that's your opinion. At one point, for example, one of the speakers said, well, I know you Americans and the Israelis say that Hezbollah has been involved in all these terrorist attacks, the bombings in Argentina, like the cover of the book and others, but we all know it's Al-Qaeda, so enough already. And nobody from the moderators, from the sponsors, said boo. My favorite was when one woman from Lebanon said, look, I know you Americans and Israelis, you believe that there is some arch-terrorist out there named Imad Mughniya. But I live in Lebanon, and I've never met him, she said. So I went and I got an audience with Hassan Nasrallah himself, because, she explained, she's a serious academic. And I asked him, in my field research, I asked him, Nasrallah, does Mughniya exist? And he told me no. Ergo, he doesn't exist, which is kind of like asking Al Capone, are you a mob boss? And Al Capone saying no, and you go about writing a journal, a scholarly article saying Al Capone is not a mob boss. I'm not a very nice person. So in February 2008, when Imad Mughniya was assassinated in Damascus, the man who was denied in life was embraced in death. Streets named after him, squares, poems, the works. After he was assassinated, since I'm not a very nice person, I wrote an email to this woman. It was very, very short. It just said, and now we're both right. My wife didn't let me send it because she's a better person than I am. But the fact of the matter is that this conference got me started on a process. How could it be that people wouldn't contradict? And what I walked away with is that the people in the U.S. intelligence community who were chairing this open source conference, they're always worried, as someone who used to be in the intelligence community, I can tell you, about what they might say and what they know from where. Better not to say anything. But the fact that there wasn't even perceived to be enough information in the open source to debunk such bombastic statements as Imad Mughniya doesn't exist and Hezbollah is not involved in terrorism, that led me down this path. But since the book is not about Hezbollah in Lebanon, I didn't spend time focused on that. I spent time talking to Romanians, to Chileans, to Canadians, to Brits and French and Singaporeans and Filipinos, and the stranger, the more interesting. The whole process really seemed to gel for me in probably the 150th interview conducted in the northeast of the United States in an old-style coffee shop where they still all use those old ceramic mugs, sitting in an old-style booth, talking to some federal agents who walked me through a series of cases that started in South America and moved to Africa and touched on China. And by the time we were done, there was not a corner of the earth that their cases had not touched, and just kind of brought all together how it is that Hezbollah, which really is Lebanon's party of God, it is a political party in Lebanon, also has this very, very broad footprint. Maybe the best place to start, if we're to start at the beginning, is to start an anniversary we're going to have next month, and that is the 30th anniversary of the Beirut bombings, of the bombings of the French and U.S. Marine barracks bombings. Because it was over an 18-month period in Lebanon that Hezbollah first started attacking Western interests, first in Lebanon over these 18 months, and then gradually in the Middle East, then Europe, then farther abroad, that really began to shape what continues to be a very adversarial relationship with the West. Imad Mughniya himself and his brother-in-law, his cousin Mustafa Badruddin, are believed to have planned the barracks themselves and then watched the bombings of the U.S. Marine barracks in particular unfold from a nearby rooftop. This is important, and you'll see as we weave through how the past is relevant to today. Imad Mughniya is gone, but his replacement is the same Badruddin, Mustafa Badruddin, who has since been indicted by the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague for the assassination of Rafik Hariri. It got too hot in Lebanon because they had bombed these U.S. Interests, and so they fled to Iran, and it was there that the Iranians helped them formally establish the kind of special operations arm, the kind of foreign terrorist element of Hezbollah, the Islamic Jihad organization, which first Mughniya led and now Badruddin led. And another reference to things that are happening today, we now know, looking back, that the U.S. government had intercepted a communication days before the bombing on September 26, 1983, from Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security to the Iranian ambassador in Damascus, telling the ambassador to contact a senior Shia militant who later became a senior Hezbollah leader, and to direct him to take, quote, spectacular action against the U.S. Marines. In the words of the commander of the Marine unit in Beirut at the time, if there was ever, and I'm quoting him, if there was ever a 24-karat gold document, this was it. U.S. intelligence had caught Iranian officials instructing a Hezbollah leader to carry out an attack targeting the Marines in Lebanon days in advance, but the information didn't make its way through the bureaucracy until October 25th, 2 days after the bombing. We now see how some of that continues today. We now know, at least in the open source reporting, that U.S. intelligence had intercepted communications about Syria's use of chemical weapons, but did not have them in real time, and it was only after the use of chemical weapons in August that was processed. In fact, Der Spiegel has reported just last week that German intelligence intercepted a call between a senior Hezbollah operative and an Iranian official, kind of freaking out and talking about how Assad was behind last month's chemical weapons attack. By the spring of 1985, the CIA is penning finished intelligence products about terrorism in Lebanon by Hezbollah with titles like Wild, Wild West Beirut. And the State Department was writing, to pick up on our last conversation, about terrorist spillover from the Middle East into Europe, in particular after the hijacking of TWA 847. It was TWA 847, it was the attacks in Kuwait carried out by Badruddin and others, and the arrest of Mustafa Badruddin in Kuwait, and Hezbollah's desire to free Badruddin in particular, that led to a whole host of operations in Europe. Many you know about, some you may not. One that was amazing to me, because everybody always assumes that Hezbollah is always and only targeting Israel, was the case of Bassam Maki, who was arrested in Germany in 1989, where he was plotting attacks targeting Israeli and American interests. The Germans intercepted his code book, where they finally understood, because they had been on his phone for a while, that every time he referred to a BMW, a certain type of BMW, he was referring to a potential Israeli or Jewish target. And every time he referred to a Mercedes or a different model of Mercedes, he was referring to an American target. Of course, then you had the 1992 and 94 bombings in Argentina. Unless you think that so much of this is happening abroad and it doesn't affect us in America, almost every one of these cases has a U.S. nexus. Most people are aware that the logistics for the 1992 and 1994 attacks were carried out by the Iranian intelligence agents through the embassy and by Hezbollah operatives, some in the tri-border area and some who were brought in specifically for the operation. Sometimes they made phone calls that were routed through the tri-border area. Sometimes they were sloppier and they made phone calls straight back to Lebanon from local payphones right near the Amiya Jewish Community Center, for example. But in other cases, they used what they thought was a secure cutout through the Iranian embassy, which Argentinian intelligence had actually penetrated. And in other cases, they used a switchboard, or someone who is functioning as a switchboard, in New York City. And they would place calls from Buenos Aires, from the tri-border area to New York City, and those calls would be routed through back to Lebanon. Later, some of the key elements tied to the Barakat Hezbollah network in the tri-border area it would turn out that Barakat himself had a multiple entry U.S. visa and had spent significant time in Miami. The bottom line is that from code words to false documents and counterfeit money, I stumbled across some of the most amazing stories of Hezbollah around the world, from horrific attacks that succeeded to hapless assignments, Keystone Cops type of stuff that you wouldn't believe if you saw it on TV, with ridiculous consequences. And let me share with you just a couple. Imagine being on the airplane TWA 847 as it's crisscrossing back and forth the Middle East, originally just supposed to be a short flight from Athens to Rome and then a connection to the United States. And in one of their backs and forths to Algiers, they land in Algiers and the hijackers demand that the plane be refueled, and they come up to the refueling station and the Algerians won't refuel the plane until some passenger or crew, provides them a credit card to pay for the $5,000 to $6,000 of gas, which an American crew member did. They came back to Algiers a second time, they asked for the credit card again, and they said, forget it. Consider, for example, that just before the bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Hezbollah came this close to successfully bombing the Israeli embassy in Bangkok just weeks earlier. And the only reason it failed wasn't because of any disruption, wasn't because anything we did, it's because the suicide bomber was not a good driver, and he got into a fender bender at 9 a.m. traffic on the way to the embassy. And it was only later, when the woman who had rented him the van came to claim her van from the traffic parking lot, that she said, wait a minute, they've tinted the windows, they put in extra shock absorbers to take more weight. What's going on with my van? And they opened it up and were overcome by noxious fumes and saw a giant vat bolted to the middle of the back of the van. And when they opened it up, they found a huge fertilizer explosive bomb and a wire going to the front with a suicide switch. And then inside the fertilizer, the body of the driver of the van who had been murdered and shoved in there. Had the attack gone off, no one would have ever known what happened to him. Other stories include the smuggling of weapons onto an airplane for a hijacking in Africa, way before 9/11, where the complicated, sophisticated means by which he got the weapons on the plane was by putting them in a box of pastries. And then later on the next flight into a bag of dirty gym clothing. And then finally in the third leg of the flight by just bribing a local official. But I think my favorite case at the end of the chapter on Hezbollah in Southeast Asia is Hezbollah's kind of backdoor side role in what's known as the Blue Diamond Affair, where a Thai foreign worker stole fistfuls of gems, supposedly egg-sized big gems, from the palace of a Saudi prince where he worked. And when the Thais failed to produce the gems in their investigations, the Saudis sent some intelligence operatives to investigate the case themselves. Unfortunately, Saudi Hezbollah and Lebanese Hezbollah together were on a tear at that point, assassinating Saudi diplomats around the world. And these 3 Saudi intelligence officers who are sent to Bangkok to investigate the theft are murdered by Hezbollah. What makes the story even more incredible is the case of the Thai police officer who goes rogue because he wants to get his hands on these gems, assassinates someone in his bid to get them, and becomes an Elvis impersonator on death row in Thailand. But some of this stuff, again, circles back to issues we're discussing right now. The chapter on Khobar Towers, for example, one of the things I was most amazed about was to see how long and historical and how intimate Hezbollah's ties go with the Sayyida Zainab shrine in Damascus. Today, and over the past couple of years, Hezbollah has said, yes, we're in Syria, primarily protecting either ethnic Lebanese or Shia shrines, most importantly to them, the Sayyida Zainab shrine in Damascus. And that may well be the case, but one should not forget that Hezbollah has real operational ties going to the Sayyida Zainab shrine, including using it as a point to recruit operatives. And in the case of the Khobar Towers bombing, this is where they met for the last operational meeting before the actual bombing. Today, Hezbollah has two distinct operational plans going on. One dates to the assassination of Mugniya in 2008, and it remains focused on assassinating a current or former senior Israeli official. Nasrallah himself has told newspapers, including one in Kuwait, if we wanted to hit Israeli tourists here or there, and he said this before we knew that Hezbollah was about to start targeting Israeli tourists, he said we can do that anytime. That's not for Mugniya. Since then, Hezbollah has also taken upon itself, at the request of Iran, the job of assassinating Israeli tourists around the world, having nothing to do with avenging Mugniya's death and having everything to do with Hezbollah playing its role in Iran's shadow war with the West over Iran's nuclear program. You want to understand why Hezbollah is involved in Syria as it is? There are lots of reasons, but the most important one, which goes back to the anniversary 30 years ago, dictates Hezbollah's efforts to assassinate Israeli tourists today and explains why, despite all the pressures that it's under at home and abroad, Hezbollah would take on this role fighting alongside the Assad regime, no longer resistance against Israel, but somehow resistance against fellow Muslims. It has to do with the fact that Iran asked them to. Syria has some of its own, Hezbollah has some of its own interests too, in particular in being able to maintain the ability to get resupply from Iran, if not through Damascus, then through Latakia. But the main reason is because Iran asked it to. And you want to know, and with this I'll conclude, you want to know how serious the international threat is? Consider not only that there are Hezbollah operatives on trial today in Thailand and in Nigeria, but that Hussam Yaqub, a dual national, a European, and the individual in Thailand on trial now is also a European, both Swedes, Swedish-Lebanese dual citizens. But Hussam Yaqub in Cyprus, when he confessed to Cypriot police, basically said, I don't understand what the big problem was. I was just collecting, and this is a quote, I was just collecting information about the Jews. And this is what my organization is doing all over the world. Thank you very much.